So, as Professor Ben pointed out, the aesthetic and the imagery of tea was essentially built in during Tang Dynasty. And even nowadays, we refer to tea and we think of tea and we describe tea and what comes with it in the same way as they did during Tang Dynasty. I am more concerned with the technical aspects of tea and tea making and tea brewing and tea tasting. But I can say the same thing. Even if nowadays tea is not made mostly and it's not consumed and it's not appreciated in the same time, in the same way it was done during Tang Dynasty, certain technical principles we were first enunciated during Tang Dynasty are still, thank you, are still are still valid today. So, as Professor Ben pointed out, what, when it is said, in fact, that the Chinese tea culture goes back 5,000 years, it's stretching it a bit far. Even if from the point of view of tradition, the Chinese like to think that, in fact, there are few factual proofs that it's not exactly like that. And when it comes to the earliest references to tea consumption in China, of course, the discovery or the invention of tea is attributed to the mythical emperor Shennong, but this goes back into the mythical origins of Chinese culture. In fact, tea is mentioned sometimes in early sources, let's say from the 11th to the 7th century BC, but we don't know exactly what those mentions talk about because of this character that you see in the slide, the character 2, which resembles the character T plus one horizontal stroke. Now, those sources essentially mention tu and they don't mention T cha the way we know it, since the earliest mention of the character cha is much later. So in fact, we can't be sure that the thing they ate or drank at the time, this kind of bitter herb, was in fact tea as we know it, or was something totally different. So, tu may have been tea, but also it could have been any other bitter herb, some sort of salad. And thereby, we are forced to discard these references because they are not totally reliable. Then again, we have a mention in the 3rd century AD of tea served as wine instead of wine, exactly in the same line of the poems mentioned by Professor Ben. That is to say, that tea was served and was consumed instead of wine, as an alternative to wine. In this specific case, it was given by a host to a guest who couldn't put up with a large quantity of wine, thereby he was given tea secretly so that the other guests didn't know what was happening, but in fact he was drinking tea instead of wine. And in this case, we consider this reference as the earliest reliable reference to tea consumption, proper tea consumption, not any concoction of any bitter herb. Then, before the 7th century AD, the general consumption of tea starts in China, as we've just been told. And from that point on, we can talk about generalized tea consumption, and also we are sure that we are talking about tea. We are talking about the plant that nowadays we call tea, which is a camellia, as you know. But as as there was, as the building of an aesthetic of tea and an imagery of tea was taking place, was being constructed in China, at the same time, those in the trade, people who grew tea, people who sold tea, people who were interested in tea, tea lovers and tea professionals, needed some rules, they needed some codes, they needed instructions on how actually to do things, on how to grow tea properly, on how to harvest it, on how to process it, on how to drink it ultimately. So not just in terms of aesthetic appreciation, sensorial appreciation, but in terms of know-how. And that's how chashu, that is to say tea books, were born. Handbooks on tea, books containing practical material informations on tea and tea culture. Those tea books, called in Chinese chashu, started being written under Tang Dynasty and went on actually until Qing Dynasty, and it became a subgenre of Chinese technical literature, the chashu, the books on tea, the handbooks on tea, or the tea monographs. Over 100 of them, actually 108 and 110 depending on how you count them, are still extant in a complete form or in fragments, and they are not all about the same subject. They all concern tea in some way, but some cover the whole range of subjects: growing, harvesting, processing, brewing, consuming, and the history of tea. Some other books are focused only on one aspect of the culture, some even on very specific subjects, like the quality of water to make tea. Actually, there's a number of tea books devoted exclusively to the choice of water. Which kind of water we can consider the ideal water to make tea? And there are lists, and the waters are classified, and the quality are classified according to different principles, and the quality of each one is discussed, and the merits of each one are discussed. So tea books are one of the main sources for the history of tea, but especially for the history of the tea industry, of how tea was actually, how the material substance, tea leaves, tea bricks, were actually made and they were consumed. Now, the earliest of all these tea books is the Chajing, the tea canon by Louis. Actually, here there's written 760 as a date of composition. In fact, the precise date is somewhere between 758 and 760. And Louis lived, as you see, between 730 and 804, which makes him contemporary of many of the poets that we've just seen. So they were writing at the same time, and maybe they didn't even know each other. They may have known about each other, but they were not in contact. Not all of them. Jiaoran, of course, was. Jiaoran was a personal friend of Lu Yu, but not all of them. And this shows that tea was already a habit. Tea was something that everybody, to a certain extent, was drinking. Everybody knew about. Everybody was concerned with. And as its virtues and its merits were discussed and praised by poets, at the same time someone was writing the know-how about tea. And Louis was the first person to do such thing. Mind you, the title itself shows you the importance of this book. It's not cha, shu, cha, ji, something like that. It's Chajing. Chajing means the tea canon. A Jing is not a book like any other book. A Jing is the most important book in a such in a certain in a given field. So the tea classic, the tea canon, the tea Bible. The book everyone has to go by if you want to do something with tea, to make something with tea, if you want to appreciate tea in the right way. Now, what is this book like? This book is divided in different sessions, and it's concerned, as I say, it covers tea growing, tea harvesting and processing, tea preparation, brewing, consumption, and then the history of tea. The history of tea is actually analyzed through quotations from previous works concerning tea. When I say quotations to previous work, of course, I'm saying something very to be taken with a pinch of salt, because, of course, how could there be previous works on tea? He doesn't mention almost entirely. Well, there are no mentions of poetry in general, except for very few lines. So most of the almost all of the poets mentioned by Professor Ben are not among the sources he quotes. He quotes mostly historical sources, or books on medicine, medical books, books on medicine, books on dietary principles, or as historical sources of different kind. Very little poetry. Also, most of the sources that he quotes, he amends, modifying the original character, whatever that was, into the character tea. So in fact, if you look up the original sources, most of which are lost, in fact, and they're only preserved in major Zhongshu or in Taiping Yulan, or in such works, you see that the character actually used in the original text is not Cha. It's not Cha, or is not Ming, or is not one of the names that nowadays are used for tea. Very often is something else. Very often is this ambiguous character Tu. So in fact, we are not sure that tea was actually consumed and mentioned in all of the sources he quotes. In some, yes, but certainly not in all of them. Anyway, he tries to build up a tradition for tea. So not just describing how to use it, how to prepare it, how to grow it, but also he tries to invent as much as possible a tradition to support all of he says about tea. In fact, when we come to tea processing, according to this book, to the Chajing, tea, as I said, tea was made in a completely different way, and was also consumed in a completely different way. So harvesting, of course, the tea was picked, but again, it was not picked the way tea is picked nowadays. That is to say, 2 leaves and a bud. No, it was the whole of it was picked, including stems and branches and leaves. So the tea pickers were not so picky. In fact, they picked it all. Why? We will see it, because in the way the tea was processed, it didn't really make a difference. Then the tea was steamed. That is to say, all they gathered, all they harvested was steamed. Then it was pounded, and once it's pounded in a mortar, you may imagine it doesn't make a difference whether it's leaves and buds and stems, because everything is mashed. Then it was put in molds. Some of the molds actually had very interesting, beautiful, attractive shapes. Then it was dried. So as you see, we're talking about preparing cakes, sort of bricks. Then those cakes, those bricks, were stringed together by burying a hole through them and putting a string through them, driving a string through them. So in the end, you had strings of tea cakes. So if you want to imagine what a tea cake is like, it's a bit like nowadays pu'er, which comes in cakes, in fact, so bricks. Only in this case they were probably smaller, but basically it's the same principle, and the final product is as hard and hard to break as pu'er tea. And this was the and then of course everything had to be stored. And it's quite interesting because what in the Chajing they Louis describes a kind of storage container which is heated, because the worst enemy of tea in general, and especially tea bricks, is humidity. So he or tea farmers devised a sort of very sophisticated storage container that could prevent tea bricks, tea cakes to get soaked by humidity. These were the tea cakes. Of course, on one side you can see the molds used to make cakes, and some of them, as you see, are very attractive, and these are obviously for imperial use, because you see the dragon and the phoenix on them. On the other side you have a pu'er tea brick, which has nothing to do with this, but still it's the same kind of tea brick. Pu'er is made differently. Nowadays it has a different kind of consumption, but still the way it is made derives exactly from what was codified in Tang Dynasty, during Tang Dynasty. Then of course, how do we make tea? How did they make tea? In a totally different way. Nothing to do with what we do, what the Chinese do nowadays. With few exceptions in some national minorities, but still it's different. You know, generally speaking, you can make tea three ways. That is to say, you can boil it as if it were a soup. You can whisk it, as in the Japanese matcha tea ceremony, or you can steep it, make an infusion, as we do nowadays. These steps are the three steps in the development of tea making history. Now, Tang Dynasty is the first step, boiling tea. That is to say, everything went with a certain amount of distinction. Everything went into the cauldron, everything was boiled, and tea was served, the product was served unfiltered. So everything was still in it. Sediments, dregs, things floating on the surface. It must have looked like some sort of soup, some sort of thick soup. Doesn't sound too attractive, but if we listen to the poets that were presented by Professor Ben, it may have been a most wonderful thing. Now, how do you prepare tea this way, according to the Chajing? You first roast the cake, the tea brick. You roast it on fire. You roast it on fire until on the surface you have some bumps, like the little bumps on the back of a toad. Once it's roasted, you grind it. Professor Ben just showed us a grinder. You remember that silver tool with a wheel The silver tool they showed us was actually found in the Famens temple, and it's a precious item as part of a treasury. It may have not been used at all, but it's a reproduction of the real thing. So it was ground in some sort of coarse powder, was sifted, okay, and finally that coarse powder was thrown into boiled water with a pinch of salt in more than one way. So with a pinch of salt because it had to be done carefully, and with a pinch of salt because they added actually a pinch of salt. The reason why salt was added, it's still under discussion. It's been discussed for many decades now, and there's no final answer. But as it's said in the Chajing, in the book itself, the result shouldn't be salty. So salt was not added to make tea salty. Probably it was added to balance the flavor, more or less the same way we put salt in cakes, or we put a pinch of salt when we bake sweets and desserts. It's there to balance the taste rather than to make it salty. So this soup, this boiled soup, was then spooned off to cups, very large cups, and the cups were served to guests. Now, this has nothing to do with the way tea, and of course it was served, yes. This has nothing to do with the way tea is served nowadays. Now, why do I insist saying that certain principles are still valid today if we make tea in a different way? Is the essential principles are still valid. The first one, I would say, is the choice of water. The choice of water was essential during Tang Dynasty, as it was in later dynasties, as it is today. Tea essentially depends on water. Tea depends on water and depends on fire. And depends, of course, on the vessel as well. Basically, it depends on fire, metal, water. The choice of water is essential, and Louis classify in this work, in the Chajing, classifies waters essentially in three large groups. In later works, waters are classified in endless groups, up to 16 and more. They're classified geographically. They're classified according to the fire. I mean, the way they are boiled. They are classified in the most sometimes bizarre ways. In Louis, everything is very down to earth, is very practical. So basically, there is spring water, there is well water, and there is river water. Spring water is spring water, so water from springs, from mountain springs. Although, as it was pointed out by my colleague, the best possible water is the water that drips from stalactites in caves on mountains, which, in my opinion, and not only in my opinion, is of course an image, is a very attractive image, but it doesn't bear any link to reality. You can't collect enough water that way to make tea unless you spend an enormous amount of time. And also, from a chemical point of view, that kind of water, in fact, is what we call too hard to make. There's too much calcium in it to make a good tea. But on the other hand, the idea is a standard of purity. This kind of milky water relates to other kind of milks and other kind of religious images, but it's not a practical, a feasible way of collecting water. Spring water, on the other hand, is considered the ideal water. Then, of course, water from a well should be taken, as Louis says, from a well of frequent use, That is to say, if the well is not frequently used, the water becomes stagnating, and it's not to be recommended. And of course, river water is should be taken from places far from cities and villages and towns, and this is another matter of fact sensible suggestion. But all these definitions of water are still valid nowadays, same as it is his description of the boiling process, which is considered to be the earliest description of heat transfer in fluids in the history of science. As you know, if you've read the book says that when you start boiling the water, first you have bubbles that look like fish eyes, which is something you experience every time you boil water, even to make your pasta, and you look at the pot. If you look carefully, the first stage you have bubbles like the eyes of a fish. The second stage, the bubbles get around the brim of the pot like pearls in a necklace. The third stage, waves. The water develops drumming waves that make a sound. After that, you should stop, because after that, the water becomes, in Louis' words, stale, flat, and thereby it should not be used. So this attention on water is one of the things that are central in Louis' work and still central in tea culture nowadays. Then of course you have consumption, principles concerning consumption, the way tea should be consumed, things that we've seen in the poems mentioned earlier. So tea doesn't go with chaos. Tea doesn't go with too many people. Tea, it's not necessarily a solitary experience, although actually it becomes the solitary experience, the hermit experience. On the other hand, tea shouldn't be consumed by and with a large number of guests. 4 or 5 guests maximum. But if you exceed that number, then tea becomes a trivial affair. It becomes a vulgar, not so refined experience. So tea is not something that should be drunk in large companies, in large parties, but it's rather, as I said, an experience for a more restricted group. And this, of course, goes with meditation, goes with spiritual experiences. Then the concept of frugal and frugality. This is, sorry, I'm just going quickly through the presentation was much longer, but was intended for now the concept of frugality. Even if you can have many implements and utensils to make tea, and some of them are essential, some are superfluous, but actually tea is not a lavish affair, is not a very formalized, tea consumption is not very formalized, is not as so formalized as the Japanese tea ceremony, but on the other hand is a frugal experience, is a simple and frugal experience. This is the word for frugal. So what goes with tea is frugality, is a certain kind of rustic simplicity, rather than, as I said, an elegant, over-refined experience. So I think basically these are the things that we can still preserve and apply from from Luyu's work. His influence, the influence of this book on world tea culture was in fact very strong, especially when it comes to Japanese tea culture. The Japanese, in fact, didn't know a translation of this book, a real translation. I don't mean a Kambun version of this text. I mean a translation in Japanese. Not until Moroka Tamotsu's work, so we are talking about the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and again, the the best known and the best in general, quality-wise, Japanese translation of this book was the one done by Nunome Chofu in the 1980s, of which you can see the cover here. But even if the book wasn't translated into Japanese, as I said, until quite late, the book was known by Japanese scholars, and the influence was still was already quite strong. It had quite an impact on Japanese tea tradition. Now, briefly before I close, as I said, boiled tea, the one described in Luyu's Chajing, is the way tea was made during Tang Dynasty. Then the following step is whisked tea, and then steeped tea the way we make it now. All those ways of making tea are actually already mentioned in the Chajing, but either discarded as minor or not important ways of making tea, or criticized as being as the result being water from the ditch that shouldn't be drank at all. So those practices, boiled, steeped, and whisked, probably coexisted since the very beginning. Only each one of them became the prevailing way of making tea within a certain period. Some of them are easier to make, some are much more difficult, some require especially processed tea, some don't. So it's not surprising that steeped tea, the way we make it now, in the long run was the most successful way, because it's the least demanding way of making tea. It's the most practical. But as I said, they coexisted for a long time until one basically prevailed over the other. I think I stop here, and if Professor Ben wants to join me, I think we can answer questions. Thank you.